The first thing Vavan Kresh noticed when he entered the lobby were the chandeliers. They floated above the guests like 1,000 twinkling stars, illuminating the rooms in a warm yet extravagant glow. The walls were painted in a regal red, and the massive maroon curtains draped across them, parting at the doors to the ballrooms. Further down the lobby, large paintings and art pieces decorated the walls, observed by onlookers who showed no apparent interest in the art itself, but rather its cultural and monetary value, and how good it would look if it sat in the garden of their mansion in Upper Devast. The second thing Vavan noticed was the number of bodyguards. For every diplomat or representative present, there seemed to be at least 1 or 2 bodyguards or higher protection standing nearby, ready to act at the beckon of their employer. Most of them wore black suits or robes, and very few of them carried weapons. The Aviary had strict rules regarding weapons at the annual ball, but he was certain a few of them had concealed firearms. This was the first time Vavan had been to the ball, having only been in office as Corval's governor for 10 months. 10 months, and already someone had tried to kill him recently. On the advice of his former mentor and commanding officer, the Grand Marshal of the Raven Military Fleet, Tem Zadera, Vavan had hired his own personal bodyguard. He looked over his shoulder to see if she was there, and sure enough, Alexstra was lumbering towards him. The monstrous, towering woman stopped as she reached him. She wore black robes with blood-red tinges on the edges, and a matching mask that covered the lower half of her face. Vavan had made sure she kept her sword in the ship, and he had hoped she had not brought any of her own concealed pistols or knives. He worried Alexstra's stature and appearance would attract attention, but after seeing the other bodyguards, his worries quickly faded. He looked up at his enforcer and spoke. "Stand over there and keep an eye out, and try not to mingle with the guests," though he knew the latter would not be a problem. Alexstra nodded and moved off. Vavan sighed and turned back to the lobby, and the opportunities waiting there. He straightened his deep blue tweed coat and walked forward into the small group of wealthy and influential people. A human and their insectoid partner ran past him on their way to the food tables, where a delicious Nav cake had just been placed down. Looking over at the tables, Vavan noticed 2 familiar men having a conversation on the couch. One wore a neatly trimmed suit, and the other was bald and fat, and wore purple Drovonian-style robes and tunic. In the fat man's hand was a glass of wine. Then Vavan remembered where he had seen them before, all over the news. For the thin man was Rita Teb, the richest man in the galaxy, and the fat man was Fygar Moon, High Master of the Pelos Plutocracy. The Plutocracy were the only ones left who owned slaves, and Vavan could not remember why they were allowed to. Rita Teb looked up and caught his eye, staring at the young governor for a moment, then went back to listening to Fygar. Wandering into one of the ballrooms, a voice called out his name. "Vavan Kresh!" The young man whirled around to see a blonde-haired man briskly striding towards him. "Yes, and you may be," Kresh replied, raising an eyebrow. "Willem Rugandar." The suited man stopped abruptly and shook his hand. "Pleasure to make your acquaintance. Halo Autocracy, right?" Vavan questioned, cocking his head to the side. "Indeed you are," Rugandar exclaimed happily. "My father died a few years back, so now I'm in charge of the utopia he built." "I've heard good things about Halocon," Vavan mused. "Now, was there a reason you called my name?" As soon as the words left his mouth, he regretted getting into the real talk too soon. "Deals typically went in your favour the longer you chatted up your guest." Fortunately, the dictator did not seem to mind, and was all too eager to reveal his offer. "I'm glad you asked." Willem wrapped his arm around Vavan's shoulder and began to walk, forcing the governor to go with him. "As you know, Halocon is a world where dreams come true, so it attracts everyone, from the wealthy to the poor, to outright refugees. Of course, that also means it attracts more unsavory type, like pirates." With his spare hand, Willem pointed a finger gun at a group of ladies in brightly coloured dresses, winking and putting on a charismatic smile as 2 of them passed. "Usually out goes the Raven Military Fleet to deal with pirates, but I don't want to sign that stupid agreement of theirs, and I've heard you've experienced the effect of this agreement firsthand." Kresh nodded. Rugandar continued. "And so, I turn to you. And you have enough ships equipped to deal with pirates. There's the supply line that they've mostly been attacking. If you are willing to accept, I can pay you handsomely." Favan knew William was being vague, but he asked the important question. "And how much would that be?" The dictator stopped and smiled. 100,000 credits. Favan shook his head. "Daylight robbery." Willem laughed. 1 million, then. The governor thought about it. "What's the supply line transporting?" Willem's smile faded. "Rhenium. But I fail to see how that's relevant." "Here's my counteroffer. My ships in exchange for 5% of the housing profits that the rhenium is used for, up until 6 months after the pirates have been neutralized." Rugendar's jaw dropped, then quickly closed again. Kresh knew he was most likely transporting rhenium in for construction and housing. 5% wouldn't be an insane amount, but it would definitely exceed the prices Willem was offering. It all would depend on how badly he wanted those pirates gone. After a moment of thinking, Rugendar gave his answer. "Deal," he huffed at last. He took out a holopad, tapped a number of things, then handed it in a holostylus to Favarn. The governor looked through it. No small print. Good. He signed it and gave it back. "Pleasure doing business. Until next time." Willem shook his hand and strode off, not as happy as when he arrived. Favan could see he had won the deal. Now he stood alone in the ballroom, despite being surrounded by politicians, delegates, and celebrities. On the far side of the room, he saw a young, red-haired woman in a green dress, standing next to a man in a grey suit who was saying something to her. Like many people here, she looked familiar, but Favarn could not figure out who it was. A finger tapped on his shoulder, and he turned around to see who it was. "Enjoying the party?" Tem Sidera leaned forward. "Oh, Grand Marshal Sidera," Crash exclaimed. "Please, just Tem." Neil Kamara smiled kindly. He was wearing a simple purple Ravens officer's uniform, which denoted his high rank. "We're not military men here." "Sorry, I did not realize you would be here," Favan replied. "Do you think I would let my mentoree go to his first Aviary ball without popping by? Ridiculous. Besides, I have some other people I need to chat to. The Van Rugendar for one." "I actually just spoke to him," the young governor said, looking up at his mentor. Stadera humphed. He gazed across the ballroom, then began to walk. Favarn followed him. "How is life for you these days?" the old man asked. "I believe I saw the bodyguard I'd suggested outside in the lobby." "Yes, she is too brutal in my opinion," Favarn answered, then screwed up his face. Stadera kept bumping into him ever so slightly, slowly knocking him off their original path. The area wasn't crowded either. Looking up at the man, he felt he wasn't even listening. It was so strange. "But you recommended her, so I might renew her contract." The next thing Favarn saw was a flurry of green, briefly some purple and grey, then the next thing he knew, he was on the floor next to a woman. It was the woman he had just saw before. She was looking rather embarrassed. As she ran through 100 variations of saying sorry, Favarn pushed himself up and extended a hand to her. "My apologies. I should have been looking where I was going," he said, slightly less embarrassed. The woman lifted her head, took his hands, and got to his feet. Favarn quickly surveyed the area for Stadera, but he was nowhere to be seen. He'd simply vanished. The girl was doing the same thing. "It seems my friend has left me," Favarn muttered. The girl stopped and glanced at him. "Same here," she said, dusting off her dress. "Honestly, I'm relieved. He's my father, trying to get me to talk to certain people." They locked eyes, and for the first time, Favarn got a good look at her. She had an emerald green dress, and bright eyes that reflected the light within the twinkling chandelier above. Her hair wasn't pure red as he thought, but rather a copper colour, which was done up in a fancy bun at the back. Her skin was fair and quite pale, as if it had never got much sunlight. It took him a moment to register that she was talking to him. "Rydak Kara," she said, holding out her hand. The young governor took it and finished the handshake. "Favarn Kresh, pleased to meet you." They both smiled and let go. For a while they stood in awkward silence, even though the sounds of music, voices, and laughter filled the room around them. "Say," Rydak began, breaking the silence, "since both of our friends have left us, and both seem to have nothing else to do, Would you accompany me for a dance? Please? The request caught Favarin off guard. His head was still spinning, he was sure of it. He took a step back, and Rydek's expression turned to one of worry. A dance? He sputtered. Sorry, but I never learnt how to dance. At least not the one they do here. He waved his hand at the swirling area of dresses and tailcoats. Rydek gave a nervous laugh. It's just a Tleron waltz. It's pretty simple. Come, I'll show you how to do it. She grabbed his hand and then paused and looked at her feet. I mean, only if you want to, she trailed off. I'm sorry, we've only just met, and it feels like I'm forcing you to do things like dance. She lifted her feet and let go of Favarin's hand. It's just that my father wants me to dance with all these different business partners of his. And you seem like a nice person. I'd very much rather dance with someone I want to. Favarin thought for a moment. She was right, but what else was he going to do tonight? Chat with a bunch of rich snobs who didn't really care about you? No, he'd at least have a little bit of fun while he was here, and this beautiful Rydek Kira girl had won him over within minutes of their meeting. Favarin gave a gentle smile and carefully took the hand she had dropped to her side and clasped it with both of his. Rydek looked up at him in hopeful surprise. Rydek Kira, I would be honoured to dance with you, he proudly said, giving a slight bow. Kira's face lit up and she suddenly pulled him into the crowd of elegantly waltzing people. Finding a clearing, she stopped and stood in front of Kresh. Rydek showed him where to put his hands and slowly guided him through the steps, whereas the orchestra began a new song. The Tleron waltz was indeed simple, and Favarin picked it up quickly. At one point, however, he accidentally trod on her foot, and she winced, but smiled and carried on. As they twirled and spun, Favarin recalled the bizarre events that led up to this point. He had literally just bumped into this girl, exchanged a few words, and now they were dancing, which till now he had never done before. When did you learn to dance? Favarin asked between breaths. My father made me take lessons when I was younger, to entertain his guests. Rydek scanned the edges of the ballroom, and Kresh knew she was watching out for her father. He saw him at the left door in his grey suit. He was looking at the two of them, but didn't seem to disapprove of them dancing. Rather than being concerned about his daughter, the man seemed to be focused on the governor of Corval himself. Then Favarin noticed the person beside Mr. Kara. Tem, said Hera. But when he and his mentor locked eyes, the old man walked back a few paces, past the doorway and into the lobby, out of sight. And how old are you now, Rydek? Favarin asked. Kara turned back to him. 26, she answered. Favarin gave a small chuckle. Same. The music began to pick up and their steps became faster. 2 steps forward, 2 steps right, twirl, then back. With each of Rydek's graceful twirls, Favarin became more and more mesmerized, completely focusing on their steps and her radiant features. Their movements developed into a fluid pattern as they moved around the ballroom floor, so focused on each other that they didn't realize the clearing had grown, and the other dancers stopped to watch this blur of green and blue complete their duet. When Kara and Kresh finally ended their waltz, the music had stopped and the ballroom erupted into applause. Holding Rydek's sweaty hand up with his own, Favarin did a clumsy bow. Out of breath, he let go and wiped his brow, and looked to his new friend. The shy, slightly awkward girl was now laughing hard, her eyes closed and totally oblivious to the weird look she was getting. And Favarin's heart melted. Later, Favarin, Kresh and Rydek Kara stood on one of the upper balconies overlooking Nestor's night skyline. It was quiet here, away from the noise of the ballrooms. Thanks for the dance earlier, Rydek said after a period of half-awkward, half-relaxing silence. It was very sudden, Favarin replied. He gazed out at the skyscrapers illuminated in the distance. We've only just met, but I feel like we could forge a bond that will stand the tests of time. He turned to face Kara, and she nodded in agreement. I would like that very much, she whispered. She moved and rested her arms on the marble railing. I never asked. What do you do? Rydek questioned. You would not have been allowed in if you weren't rich, influential, or had a seat on the Aviary. I'm the governor of Corval, Favarin answered. Ah, Rydek nodded her head. Now I can put a face to a name. And you? Vavan returned the question. Radek looked at him as if the answer was obvious. She opened her mouth to speak, but was interrupted. There you are, a voice came from behind them. Radek immediately bolted upright, her posture straight. Vavan turned to see who it was. A wizened alien hastily strolled towards them. I've been looking for you everywhere, the newcomer exclaimed to Radek. We're about to make a toast in the main ballroom. We need you there. He stopped to notice Vavan. Ah, you must be the new Governor Corval. He shook the young man's hand. Hi, Councillor Toran Huogar. Vavan Kresh, pleasure to finally meet you. Toran gestured to Radek. And I see you've already met Councillor Kara. Vavan's eyes widened and whirled around. Wait, you're the Councillor Kara? Radek sheepishly smiled and nodded. Kresh noticed her demeanour had changed a bit. She seemed stiff and more professional. I had no idea. Vavan stepped back, giving her some room to leave. Please, don't let me hold you back from your duties. I'm sorry I wasted your time. Toran bowed his feathered head to Vavan's flustered apologies and began to shuffle out of the balcony with his light blue robes and clawed feet. Radek lingered a little longer, still looking up at the shocked governor. It was definitely not a waste of time, she whispered to him. I just lost track of time, that's all. Vavan privately wondered if her father dragging her around also played a part in the loss of time. The man's actions seemed odd now, with the revelation of Radek's career. No person should be using a counsellor as personal political advantage, even if they were a relative. Radek walked past him to the doorway, then turned around. Good night, Vavan. She gave a small, friendly wave. I'll see you around. She lifted her emerald dress and ran off after Huagar. Kresh returned the wave, but she was already gone. He turned back to the balcony railing and became lost in thought. She was an Aviary councillor? Councillors were the leaders of the Aviary, the most well-known people in the galaxy. How did he not recognize her? Vavan thought she looked familiar, now thinking back on a single Aviary debate he had attended 6 months ago. Of course, she had been far away at the time, on the council panel, and he had been focused on the debate itself. He was way out of his league. Vavan could not deny that he liked Radek Kara, but the idea of pursuing a relationship was out of the question now, even if she supported the idea of it as well. The main problem was his own status. As he was the leader of the Level 5 planetary government, Kresh was required to follow Aviary protocols and the sort. So if anything happened between the two of them, concerns would be raised regarding Radek's neutral viewpoint councillors were required to take in diplomatic situations. If Vavan was part of a dispute with another faction, and Radek was needed to attend as a negotiator or mediator, would she act as a neutral party, or would her feelings for him alter her decisions and cause bias? Vavan shook his head. He was overthinking it. Tonight was probably just a once-off thing. Tomorrow would be business as usual. Although, in 2 weeks' time a debate was set to take place in Aviary's headquarters here on Nestor, the Dome. Her attitude towards him then would determine whether those feelings were worth developing. But for now it was too late, and Vavan had no reason to stay any longer. He called up Alextra. Prepare my ship. Going to stop by the toast in the ballroom, then I'm leaving. The enforcer grunted in response, and the comlink line switched off. Vavan put it in his pocket. He slowly made his way back to the lobby, happily humming to himself.